So yeah, I've been working on climate change for about 30 years. I mean, going back to what my mom said, back in high school. So Newark High School, class of 1984, married to University of Delaware, chemistry, class of 1989. My son went to UD. Can't remember which year he graduated. Anyway, we have deep roots in Delaware. But yeah, now I work for a company called ICF. I'm a vice president there. Um, and I was really happy to be asked by Consumer Reports to work on this study called The Cost of Climate Change to an American Born in 2024. And I'll tell you a little bit about why I was so thrilled to be involved in this study. A whole bunch of people worked on this thing. It took a village. And I also want to be transparent about the funding. So ICF, received funding from Consumer Reports. Consumer Reports received some of the funding that they provided to ICF from Breakthrough Energy. And you can see the report and the full methodology. It's like a 130-page document that describes what we did and provides all the references. That's the second URL on this page. So earlier this year, we released it. We worked on it for about a half a year, and it came out and got a fair amount of coverage. And I'll show you a little bit about the coverage, but most importantly, I'll tell you what we uncovered. So let me go to the next slide. Oh, before that, also in the spirit of transparency, just one slide about what is ICF. So it's a company. It's a publicly traded company. We have about $2 billion in annual revenue. We were founded by one of the Tuskegee Airmen, a guy named Lucky Lester. He was a fighter pilot. And he founded something called the Inner City Fund. So he was trying to drive financing to inner cities to help to support populations there that could really benefit from an additional infusion of funding. Over time, actually in a relatively short period of time, the Inner City Fund started doing consulting work and it outgrew its title of just being a financial fund. I'm not sure exactly when the name Inner City Fund was dropped. Now we are just 3 letters. I hate when people say, what does ICF stand for? And I say nothing, because we stand for a lot. And our purpose, our vision is to build a more prosperous and resilient world for all. And I really like the word all, because we really do try to represent that. And you'll hopefully see a little bit of what we mean by all when I talk about the results from this report. So that's the company that I work for. And within this 9,000 person company is a pod of people of about 200 people that work full-time on climate change. And this may be the largest climate consultancy in the world. I'm not sure. I don't really have a way of knowing that, but we think we may be the world's largest climate consultancy. Okay. All right. So why did we do this study? So a lot of the literature, a lot of the public-facing literature about climate change is about how climate change will affect nature, how it will affect things in the future. And a lot of it is presented from a scientist's point of view. So they tell the story of climate change as scientists talk to each other in that manner. We use equations. We spend 37 pages describing our methodology before we say anything about what we concluded. So a lot of the way that we communicate as scientists just doesn't resonate with the public. It's great for talking with scientists, but it's not great for communicating about climate change. And that's in contrast to sort of the way that normal people talk with each other. They relate to each other about sort of what matters to them. And we talk, kind of within our own tribe. We have our own language. And just frankly, one of the ways in which we talk with each other about what matters is how much do things cost? Much less so about how are the polar bears doing in some place that they've never been to? But what's salient to most people, I think most people, is the amount of money that they have, which gives them options to do things in the world, and to, yeah, get by. So Consumer Reports had the idea of, let's just communicate in that way about climate change. And the study that they commissioned was really the first ever of its kind. Okay, so before I jump into sort of my perspective, let me give you CBS News's perspective on the report that we released. I'm not sure whether this is going to work, but let's launch into this video. It's about 90 seconds long, and they do a much better job of explaining us than we do of explaining us. So let's give it a whirl.
As the effects of climate change become more visible, it's impacting parenting choices. Listen to this. 53% of those surveyed last year by Morning Consult said climate change impacted their decision to have more kids. And a new study by Consumer Reports and climate research firm ICF shows just how climate change-related costs will add up for future generations. Climate change costs will add up to $500,000 for babies born this year. And when you factor in more uncertain elements, like the ability to save for retirement, it could add up to $1 million throughout an American's lifetime. According to researchers, climate change will make things more expensive and also reduce people's incomes. Costs will rise by $255,000 over a 2024 baby's lifetime, while net income will drop by $625,000. Climate change is expected to impact nearly every aspect of American life. Housing, transportation, healthcare, food, and energy prices are all expected to see increases. For example, energy costs are estimated to be 60% higher 80 years from now. That would mean energy spending could reach more than $6,000 per year in 2104. And the study also notes that not all Americans will feel the changes evenly. If a 2024 baby chooses a climate-sensitive career like agriculture, the hit to their net income could be 3 times higher than the average employee. A similar disparity is expected for people living in places more at risk for natural disasters. As the effects of...
Whoops. Don't want to repeat that. Okay. Jill, could you hear that video?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. I'm so glad that you weren't just sitting in silence for 90 seconds.
Oh, no.
Okay, great. So as they said, we looked at those things, and here's an infographic that summarizes what we found. And we basically divided our analysis into 2 parts. One was looking at net income, which includes the employment income that people receive during their lifetime. We looked at the amount of taxes that they pay on that, and we looked at their retirement income. And then on the other side, we looked at essentially the cost of living, so how the cost for things might change as a result of climate change. And we only looked at how climate change may affect these things. We didn't try to make predictions of prices per se. We just looked at the literature that's available that would create, that speaks to how climate change might affect the cost of things. And so over time, this graphic starts today, 2024, and then it marches through to when the person's 20 years old, when they're 40 years old, and when they're 80 years old. And the numbers on both sides for net income and cost of living, those are the cumulative amounts, the cumulative costs. And so right now, there is some cost that we're bearing associated with climate change. We didn't try to quantify that. We looked more at a change in relation to today. And so in the next 20 years, the person born today will have some, be seeing some impact in terms of their net income and in terms of their cost of living accumulated over that 20 years. But it really starts to ratchet up exponentially by the time they're 40, and by the time they're 80, much larger impacts. And we estimate conservatively that the sum of those impacts of the losses to net income and the increases in the cost of living, you sum those up, is at least $500,000. But we think that it's actually closer to $1 million or more than that. So just for example, when this person is 40, we calculate that they would see a reduction in net income of about $3,900 a year. And we, on the other side of the equation, we estimate that the cost of living would, it's actually increased. There's a negative sign, that should be a plus sign. The cost of living will increase by about $4,300 a year. And I just wanted to asterisk this point about this, our bottom line estimates, that we're fairly confident that the quantitative analysis that we did in this study is an underestimate of the impacts of climate change. So for example, personal tax, or our estimate of personal taxes doesn't take into account things like increased military intervention as a result of climate change. And we're already seeing the military engaging in ways, and I could go into that, I won't right now. It doesn't include impacts to ecosystem services and biodiversity. There are ways of monetizing that. We didn't incorporate that in here. It doesn't account for risks to federal lending for housing and mortgages. It doesn't account for damages to federal buildings and many more things. And that's just on the personal tax side. I'll explain a little bit why those things relate to personal taxes in a second. But those are the kinds of factors for just one of the elements of the study that we didn't include, and why we make the assertion that our analysis is probably a significant underestimate. So what's the study based on? So it's based upon the best available data about physical climate change. So how the climate, how temperature, how precipitation, how storms, and the things that they contribute to, like wildfire and drought, how those things may change in the future. And we use the best available data that are used in the National Climate Assessment. Our staff at ICF actually staffed the U.S. National Climate Assessment, which is the gold standard assessment for climate change in the United States. We used those same data in this study. We looked at two different climate scenarios: a low emissions scenario, which assumes that the world gets their act together and significantly reduces emissions and puts us onto a pathway of climate stabilization. And then we looked at a relatively high emissions scenario. It's not the highest emissions scenario, but one in which there's not much intervention to reduce emissions. The results that I will talk about and that we focus on in the report are the high scenario. And the reason is because we kind of conclude with a little bit about what the value would be of what happens if the world actually gets its act together. And so I'll say a little bit about, at the end, about the difference between the high and the low emissions scenario. And our analysis is based on, I think it's over 100 peer-reviewed studies that look at the impacts of climate change on personal level finances. Okay, so for the net income loss, as I said, we broke it into these buckets. The biggest and the most speculative, just to be upfront about it, the most speculative and the largest is regarding lifetime retirement income. And we estimate that the hit there is on the order of magnitude of about $400,000 over a person's lifetime. The tax increases that someone might see are on the order of about $200,000, and the reduction in employment income is significantly less, but not nothing, about $25,000. So let me peel that back just a little bit. So our baseline for the economics here is based on data from places like the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis, Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Social Security Administration, Census, and also commercial data, places like Vanguard and Fidelity, where we're looking at retirement incomes. So that allowed us to establish a baseline, a no climate change scenario, and then we compared climate change to that. The retirement impacts were estimated as a result of changes in the value of corporate stocks that are held in retirement portfolios. And the impacts to those stocks are due to things like higher cost to companies. So that could be something like higher cooling costs. It could be due to declines in corporate productivity. So declines in labor productivity. And there's a lot of evidence, for example, that labor productivity increase or decreases as temperature increases in really temperature exposed sectors like outdoor industry, agriculture. Another way in which corporate revenues are likely to decrease is just simply damage, weather-related damage to physical assets and supply chains. So flooding damages to raw materials, and then reduced resource availability. So for example, a reduction in the availability of lumber in a particular area, which could drive up costs. Okay, the tax impacts. I flagged this at the beginning. I mentioned a lot of things that we didn't include. But we calculated the tax impacts as a result of higher government costs and declining government revenues, with the assumption that those government expenditures would essentially get passed along to the taxpayer in the form of taxes. Now, there's a chance that those higher government expenditures could just be absorbed in the debt, but either way, it's not good. I mean, it's either higher taxes or it just our debt increases. We made the assumption that it just gets passed directly along as higher taxes. I actually don't think that's likely. I actually think it's probably more likely that it gets passed along in debt. But that will just come to bite us in an even bigger way down the road. But the government costs are, paying for things like increased damage to roads, increased damage to the kinds of services that the government provides, and the declining government revenue is we expect to see a small but not insignificant decrease in the GDP. And so the tax revenue that the government receives, we expect that to go down over time. And then, the third area that we looked at was employment impacts, and we only looked at employment impacts estimated as a result of lost work hours. There are other ways in which employment may be affected, employment income may be affected by changes in wages themselves, the wage rate, but we didn't look at that. We only looked at lost hours. So let me pause there. It looks like Scott and Sandy have a question or a comment.
Question, yes. So we're already seeing that states like California, Florida, and now Texas are losing insurers, right? So this is obviously going to be an area that gets picked up by the taxpayers at some point, or they just stop rebuilding, right? Where was that in your analysis?
We didn't look at the complete withdrawal of insurers, but so the part of the analysis is the part that I'll talk about next.
Okay.
I will just say that we didn't look at the withdrawal from markets as an impact, but what we did look at increases in premiums as an impact.
At 2x, 3x, both.
What increased percentage did you look at?
A percentage of what?
Percentage of premiums.
Did you double them, triple them?
No, we didn't we didn't impose an increase in premia. We calculated that based on what the literature says the effect of climate change might be on insurance premiums. So that wasn't something that we imposed. That wasn't a scenario. That was a calculated variable for us. And
Peter, is it better if we finish this question, but is it better that we wait till the end and ask questions? Is that?
I'll say a little bit more about this.
Okay.
So I keep spinning through and then, Scott and Sandy, if you guys have more questions about it, we can come back to it. But it's a really important thing that you're asking about. Okay, so then the other part of the equation is the costs. So how will our cost of living increase? And we estimate that to be about $255,000 over an 80-year lifetime. The largest bucket is an increase in energy expenditures. And there we only calculated the effect of temperature change on energy demand. We did not estimate a change in energy price and factor that in. That could also significantly change the equation here. Housing, we looked at two things. One is physical damage to houses that would be borne outside of insurance policies. And the second is that we looked at changes in insurance premia. I hope that, is premia the plural of premium? Premiums? I don't know, whatever multiple of those is.
I mean, it sounds cool. If nothing else, go with it.
Right? I don't know. The next largest category that we looked at was an increase in food costs. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. Healthcare costs and transportation. So the next slide sort of breaks that out a little bit more. So again, we calculated sort of baseline values, and then from that, then we use the available scientific literature that looks at impacts of climate change on prices. So for food, we looked at projected changes in the United States on corn and wheat production. And so like we estimated, for example, the amount of bread-like products that are flour intensive, and we tied that to the change in wheat price. We looked at corn intensive products, tied that to changes in corn prices. And then we had a third bucket, which was non-corn, non-wheat products, which includes meat products. It's just this bucket, and we applied that sort of bucket factor to the prices. On the housing side, I mentioned that we looked at flood damage, and we looked at insurance costs. I mentioned how we basically how we dealt with energy costs, and that's based on a study that we did ourselves about a decade ago, actually, for EPA. On the transportation side, again, just showing you sort of just the little sliver of the finances that we looked at. We looked at the ways in which climate change, or the way in which climate change may increase the number of vehicular crashes due to the increase in precipitation and the increase in storminess. And so there are relationships between increases in crash incidents and the amount of precipitation that occurs in a place. And we use those relationships to estimate the change in the number of crashes, and then and from that then derive the cost of the crashes. But we didn't look at sort of the type of vehicles and how that may change, or the fuel consumption from vehicles. All of that is just something that we didn't take into account in the study. And then in terms of healthcare, we looked at the projected changes in temperature and how that may affect heat-related illness frequency and the associated costs. But we didn't look at changes in infectious disease. We didn't look at changes in air quality. We didn't look at changes in direct morbidity and mortality as a result of flooding or other severe events. So there's a whole bunch of things on the healthcare side that we didn't look at. But even with that, we came up with this kind of sum estimate of about $5,000 over someone's lifetime. So the kind of the final part of the analysis that I'll speak to is how we looked at regional differences and different characteristics, different kinds of people, and how these costs may be borne across different sort of kinds of people. And so we created 4 personas to illustrate that, to say that not everybody is the same. Not everybody is a white male. That these impacts are going to be pretty different depending on where you're from and who you are. So we looked at Anne, who's a cis Asian female who works as a construction worker in Tampa. Bianca is a queer woman of Hispanic heritage. She's an IT professional in Reno. We looked at Chris, who's a cisgender Caucasian male, who's a farm equipment operator in Iowa. And we looked at Derek, who's an African-American male who works as a nurse in Boston. So those are the 4 personas that we looked at, and we did specific quantitative analyses to look at how climate change would affect them. And you can compare that to how the average person in the United States is affected. And so here's a long sort of litany of things, but let me just call out a couple of things. So for Anne, who's this construction worker in Tampa, she's probably going to see higher housing costs. And by age 40, her housing may account for as much as 60 to 70% of her annual expenses. And because that number is so large is in part because she's a construction worker. And so she doesn't have a lot of income. And so as extreme weather is increasingly affecting housing in Tampa, those relative costs are going up. Extreme weather may increasingly curtail the number of days that she's able to work there as a construction worker. There is an upside that there will be times when someone with her skill set is really needed to repair and recover from extreme events. Her healthcare expenses are likely going to rise as she's exposed increasingly to extreme outdoor temperatures. And as a person of color, she may, if she is like the average person of color, she will tend to experience disproportionate impacts from climate change. And there's a lot of literature that indicates that people of color disproportionately bear the brunt of disasters. But it's not just people of color, it's LGBTQ plus people, it's elderly, and there are a variety of other things that tend to drive things up relative to the average American. Her personal taxes are likely going to rise over the course of her lifetime. She's going to see some loss in net income. It's not a ton over her lifetime, but she's not making a ton. And so because of the combination of these factors, much of her disposable income may be wiped out and may force her to give up home ownership, and also affect her ability to save for retirement. And so she may end up, so in a non-climate change world, she may be able to be supported in part by just a little bit of savings, but with climate change, it seems likely that would wipe out a lot of her potential savings and just force her to live off Social Security. We looked at Bianca. She's a queer woman of Hispanic heritage in Reno. So just like everybody across the country, food expenses will likely go up. She's a skier. So we really went into a lot of detail in creating these personas. She's not going to be able to enjoy that as much as she did earlier in her life. The wildfires will increase out in Reno, Western United States. That will affect her respiratory function, but because she's an IT professional, she's a little bit less vulnerable to that than an outdoor worker that doesn't breathe filtered air for much of their daylight hours. And as a queer woman of color, she's part of multiple marginalized groups, and this additionality and this intersectionality will likely increase the burdens that she experiences. And there's, we've actually at ICF, we've done some research that looks at and actually monetizes the impacts of climate change on mental health. Specifically, we've looked at the impact of climate change on suicide and what the economic implications of that are. I could go into that more But anyway, the point being that she will likely bear the effects in a more significant way than the average American. And then the last two persona. So Chris, he's a farm equipment operator, and there's going to be days when it's going to be so hot that he's probably not going to be able to work, and that will cut into his revenue because he's not paid when he doesn't work. The climate change will also decrease crop yields by mid-century, leading in some cases to a reduction in the amount of work that he's able to do. Some of the other costs associated with agriculture are going to put pressure on his wages as farmers try to remain viable. The increase in heat waves is likely going to drive up his healthcare costs. The flood losses that he sees in Vinton, which is, I believe it's, is it on the Missouri or the Mississippi? It's on a major river. And so the average person in Vinton, we didn't pick exactly where Chris is in Vinton, Iowa, but the average person in Vinton, we expect to see this, approximately $3,100 in annual flood losses by the age of 40. And these types of impacts may be so significant that they drive Chris out of farming and break the legacy of farming that his family has been with for generations. And then finally, we looked at Derek, who's a cis African-American man who works as a nurse in Boston. Boston is seeing rising sea levels and increased flooding damage over time, which will translate into higher housing costs and insurance costs. As someone who works in the emergency room, there will be times during extreme weather events where the demands on Derek in the emergency room are greater than they would be without climate change. Boston's history of redlining has led to environmental disparities, and Derek would not be likely not be exempt from some of those historical impacts. So, for example, some of the poorer areas in Boston relative to some of the more affluent areas, there can be something on the order of about 7.5 degree Fahrenheit difference, and that can lead to differences in health condition and morbidity. And in this persona, we had him as someone who works not only in the healthcare system, but also does a lot of community work. And he's seeing that firsthand as he's working in the communities. He's seeing the community in which he works as being increasingly affected by climate change. So those are the four personas. Brought a little bit more character to the types of impacts that we described on average in the sort of the main part of the study. So getting toward the end here, this is, I think, my last slide. The bottom line: climate change will have a significant impact on American standard of living. There's a significant difference, it turns out, in the impacts between the high and the low emission scenario. And here mitigation matters. And so the work that you all are doing in Delaware to push the state toward renewable energy can have a difference, can make a difference in the effects on personal finances. So, for example, lifetime retirement income could increase by just 1%. So increase by 1% under the low scenario compared with the 16% decrease under the high scenario. And lifetime tax increases could be just 0.4% under the low scenario, up to 15% in the high scenario, which I focused on in the talk here. And overall net income would increase by only 0.2% under the low scenario, but under the high scenario, it would fall by 10%, or a loss of $625,000. So mitigation really matters in terms of the impacts on personal finances. And I guess the last word that I wanted to say in the prepared remarks is that this study is the first of its kind. As I've said, it's highly incomplete. There are, and just even within the things that we did look at, there are better ways to look at it. I hope it's improved upon. It should not be the last word, but we're happy and proud that we've been able to provide this first word on what the sort of the order of magnitude impacts of climate change may be on personal finances of a person born in 2024. So that's all I've got. What questions, what comments, what advice, suggestions do you have?
Well,